On a hot July morning in 2004, 56-year-old Susan Sutton and her husband John stepped out of their $1 million home in Coral Gables, Florida. It was one of those days in South Florida when the temperature was a hot 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but the humidity made it feel even hotter. Susan could already feel sweat on her arms, and her shirt was sticking to her skin as she and John walked to their car parked in the driveway. But the heat didn't bother Susan. She loved the summer weather. Susan climbed into the passenger seat of the car, and her husband John got behind the wheel. They pulled away from the house and then headed through Coral Gables towards a nearby town where they were going to have breakfast with their son and his fiancée. Susan was average height, and she had a bright smile with perfect teeth. She had dirty blonde hair, but she sometimes missed dyeing it bright blonde like she'd done when she was younger. As for her husband John, he was tall with graying hair and blue eyes. When Susan and John were a young couple, people couldn't get over how good they looked together, like a fairy tale couple. And even as they got older, most people who knew them thought Susan and John were a perfect pair who had everything you could ever ask for. As the couple drove along, Susan glanced out the window and watched the city pass by. Susan had lived in Coral Gables since she was 13 years old, and as far as she was concerned, there was no better place to live in the whole world. Coral Gables was known as one of the most upscale communities in the Miami, Florida area. The secluded enclave was dotted with Mediterranean-style houses sitting on huge lots with palm trees in the front yards and big swimming pools in the back. The city was safe, beautiful, and only about 10 miles from Miami Beach. In the car, Susan and John talked about their work for a while. John was a very successful attorney, and Susan managed his and his partner's law firm. Some of their friends would ask Susan and John if it was difficult to work with their spouse. They figured always being together must get old at some point. But Susan said she loved working with John and managing his office, and she said John's partner, a gifted lawyer named Teddy Montoto, and all the employees at the office were like extended family. So she barely even saw the law firm as work. After driving for about 45 minutes, John turned onto a residential street and he parked the car in front of a new townhouse. John and Susan got out of the car and they walked up to the townhouse front door. They had bought this townhouse for their son and his fiancée about a month earlier, and they couldn't wait to see what the young couple had done to the inside of their new place. Susan knocked on the door, and then her 25-year-old son, Christopher, opened it up with a huge grin on his face. Christopher was a big guy. He was over 6 feet tall, and he weighed about 250 pounds. So when he hugged his mom, she almost disappeared in his arms. Christopher led his parents inside, and right away Susan could smell food cooking in the kitchen. Christopher beamed while he led his parents through the townhouse and showed them all the new furniture and decorations that he and his fiancée, Juliet Driscoll, had added to the place since they'd moved in. While Christopher gave his parents a tour of the place, Juliet shouted out hello from the kitchen, and then she came out and joined everybody in the living room a couple of minutes later. Juliet was 23 years old, and she was pretty with long brown hair. Susan and John both said that she kind of reminded them of the hippies, the free-spirited folks they'd grown up with in the 1960s. Juliet hugged Susan and John and told them how excited she was that they'd come over for breakfast. Susan and John had treated Juliet almost like their own daughter ever since the time she and Christopher had begun dating. And now Susan and John were thrilled that the two of them were planning their wedding. And Susan and John were also very happy that they'd been able to provide Christopher and Juliet with such a wonderful place to live as they began this new phase of their life together. Christopher led his parents into their small dining room, and then John and Susan took a seat at the table. Then Christopher went into the kitchen and he helped Juliet bring out all the food. After the food was served, they began to eat, and as they did, the whole group began to talk mostly about work. Juliet was the receptionist at John's law firm, and she knew he was in the middle of a huge case, and so she asked him how it was going. Then the subject changed to Christopher and Juliet's wedding planning. Susan immediately got so excited hearing about the design for the invitations and the honeymoon they were going to take in Samoa, a collection of islands in the South Pacific. Susan was excited, like most other moms would be when their oldest child was finally getting married, but there was actually more to it than that for her. Because there was a time in Susan's life when she had believed she would never have kids. 30 years earlier, back in 1974, Susan and John had been set up on a blind date. And within a few minutes of meeting each other, they both decided that going on that blind date was the best decision they'd ever made. After that first meeting, Susan and John had quickly fallen in love and started planning the rest of their lives together. And both of them knew that they wanted to start a family as soon as possible. Susan loved kids, and she had dreamed of being a mother since she was young. But soon after Susan and John did get married, about a year after that first blind date, Susan had the first of several miscarriages. And in the years following, she had undergone a series of unsuccessful fertility treatments, and eventually she was just told by her doctors that unfortunately, she would never be able to bear her own kids. At the time when this news came in, Susan had felt like she'd somehow let her husband down and robbed him of the family and the future that they had both dreamed about. But then, Susan had looked into adoption. She knew there were children all over the world who needed homes, and she and John had a very safe and loving home that they could provide. So, 4 years after the couple had gotten married, Susan and John's dream of starting a family came true when they adopted and brought home Christopher when he was just 2 days old. Then, 7 years later, they had adopted their daughter, Melissa, and their family finally felt perfect and complete. At the dining room table, Susan smiled as she listened to her son talk about his and Juliet's wedding, and while she didn't say it out loud, she was already looking forward to the day that she would become a grandmother. The family finished their breakfast and continued talking for a while, but then John said he needed to get home and call his partner, Teddy Montoto, so they could do some work on their current case. Susan thanked Juliet for the amazing food, and then followed John outside the townhouse back to the car. Later that day, while John worked, Susan thought about going swimming in the pool. But first, she wanted to check on her daughter, Melissa, who had just moved away for her first year of college. So Susan called Melissa, and right away she could tell her daughter was very nervous about her classes that were going to start in a few weeks. Susan and John had always taken their kids' education very seriously, and they had been able to send them to great schools. Christopher had even attended an international boarding school when he was a teenager. So Susan told Melissa she was absolutely prepared for college and that she was going to do great. Then Susan told her daughter that she loved her, hung up, and went into the living room where John was working. She asked him how it was going. John grinned and said it was actually going really well, and he was pretty sure he and his partner, Teddy, were about to make a lot of money. Susan kissed John and said that if that happened, they should definitely have Teddy and everybody else from the law firm over to celebrate. Then she headed upstairs, put on her bathing suit, and went out to the pool. Susan lounged by the pool in the hot summer sun and looked out over the large canal that circled their neighborhood. Being on the canal made the house feel even more like an oasis that was separate from the rest of the world. And as Susan lay there lounging in the sun, she thought about her son getting married and her daughter starting college, and her husband potentially about to win a huge lucrative legal case, and she wondered if it was even possible for her to be any happier. In the early evening of August 22, 2004, about a month after the breakfast at Christopher's, music and laughter drifted through Susan and John's house. They were hosting a big party to celebrate both Susan's 57th birthday and also John's huge win in court that had made them over $1 million. John walked around the house, pouring champagne for friends, family, and employees from the law firm. At one point, most of the partygoers were gathered in the living room, and John raised his glass. He said he knew people were there to celebrate Susan and himself, but he said he wanted to give a toast to his son Christopher and to his fiancée Juliet, who would soon be his daughter-in-law. And so everyone else raised up their glasses and cheered on the young couple. Then John stepped away from the group and then returned shortly after, but this time with his phone in his hand. He held the phone up, and his daughter Melissa said hello to everybody. Then she wished her mom a happy birthday and said how bummed she was that she couldn't be there. Susan told Melissa that she missed her too, but she said that she was so excited that Melissa was actually starting her college classes now and was really getting into the flow of life in college. Susan hung the phone up, and as she did, she heard a fork clinking against a glass. She looked across the living room towards the sound, and she saw that John's partner, Teddy was now getting ready to make another toast. Once everyone was listening, Teddy stopped clinking the glass, and then he told everyone in the room how lucky he had been to meet John and get to work with him, and how Susan and the kids had made him feel like he was a part of their family. Melissa even referred to Teddy as her godfather. Then Teddy toasted to the birthday girl, Susan, shouted cheers, and downed his drink, and everybody else did the same. The party lasted for a few hours, and then everybody started to clear out. Christopher and Juliet wished Susan happy birthday again, and then they left, and then Teddy and the rest of the law firm employees left not long after them. At about 10 p.m., John headed to the main bedroom to lie down and watch some of the Summer Olympics on TV. Susan got dressed for bed, she kissed John goodnight, and then she walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. Lately, Susan had been sleeping in that guest bedroom because John often stayed up late either working or watching TV to wind down from work. In the guest room, Susan climbed under the covers, and then she put her phone on the nightstand. She was expecting a call. And a few minutes later, her phone rang, so she smiled and answered it. But almost as soon as she had put the phone to her ear, she stopped talking, because she thought she heard something moving around outside of her door. Susan tossed the phone down on the bed next to her and strained her ears to listen, and as she did, a terrified look came across her face. She could hear John screaming from the bedroom down the hall, but before she could get up to see what was going on, her door flung open. And when Susan looked up, she screamed and pulled the covers tight. At 10:30 p.m., so just minutes after the door to Susan's bedroom had swung open, John crawled across the floor in the main bedroom. He could feel warm blood running down his face from both of his eyes, and he couldn't see anything. Pain ripped through his face, his arms, his hands, but somehow John managed to grab the bedside table, and he pulled himself up to his knees. He ran his hands along the table and felt his phone. He grabbed it, flipped it open, ran his fingers over the numbers on the keypad, and dialed 911. When the emergency operator picked up, John yelled out that he'd been shot, and then he shouted his address and said he did not know if his wife was okay. Then, with the phone still in his hand, John crawled across the floor to the bedroom door. He grabbed the doorknob and got to his feet. The pain at this point was agonizing, but John stumbled out into the hall and he staggered towards the front of the house, feeling his way along the wall the whole time. The 911 operator said police and paramedics were on the way, but John could barely understand what they were saying. His ears were ringing, his breath was labored, and he felt himself starting to lose consciousness. Minutes later, John made his way to the front door, still unable to see anything, but he reached out and grabbed the doorknob and used whatever strength he had left to throw the door open. Outside, he could hear sirens wailing in the distance as cars and trucks sped towards his house. A minute later, an ambulance pulled up out front, and a Miami-Dade County paramedic leapt out and ran towards the house. The young man couldn't believe what he was seeing. John had multiple open wounds and was losing massive amounts of blood. The paramedic had no idea how John had been able to get to his feet and make it outside considering his wounds, but either way, the paramedic rushed over to John and told him he was here to help, at which point John felt for the EMT and just collapsed into his arms. A few minutes later, a SWAT truck roared down the street in the affluent Coral Gables neighborhood. John and Susan's neighbors had already stepped outside of their houses when the ambulance arrived, and they had watched as John was loaded into the ambulance on a stretcher before it sped down the street. Now, most of the neighbors stood there in total shock. SWAT vehicles were not something they were used to seeing. The SWAT truck came to a stop outside of John and Susan's house, and several members of the Miami Police Department SWAT team stepped out. They crouched down low with their weapons in hand and all their tactical gear on, and they slowly approached the front door. When the 911 call had come in, it wasn't clear if there was still a perpetrator on the premises, so police were just not taking any chances, hence the SWAT team. One of the SWAT officers approached the front door and fired a concussion grenade into the house. A concussion grenade creates a really loud bang and bright light, and it can release low-density fragments to temporarily incapacitate anyone who is within the explosion area. After the concussion grenade had exploded, several SWAT officers immediately entered the house and began doing a sweep of all the rooms. 2 officers walked down the hallway towards the guest bedroom. The door was open, and they entered with their weapons drawn. But when they stepped inside that room, all they saw were sheets and a comforter piled up on the bed. One of the officers stepped closer and saw multiple bullet holes in that comforter, and he also saw bloodstains on the wall behind the headboard. The officer leaned over and pulled back the comforter and sheets, and when he did, he kind of hung his head down in respect. Under all those covers and sheets was Susan Sutton, and she was dead. She had been shot multiple times at close range. It was a horrific scene, but it was not just the violence that got to these SWAT officers that found her. Based on the position of Susan's hands and how the sheets and comforter had appeared on the bed, the officers could tell that in her sheer panic and fear, Susan had attempted to hide under the covers like a child to protect herself from her killer. And the thought of that just seemed absolutely tragic. The SWAT officers completed their sweep of the house, and at the end of it, they were certain the killer was no longer on the premises. So the SWAT team headed outside to wait for detectives from the Miami-Dade County Police to show up. But as the SWAT officers crossed the front yard, they heard a car come to a screeching halt not far from the house. And then they saw that car's door fly open, and a man jumped out and began running towards them with a gun in his hand. The SWAT officers jumped into action and shouted at the man to put his weapon down, and this man quickly obeyed, holstering his weapon and raising his hands up into the air. And as soon as he did, one of the SWAT officers rushed over to confront him, to figure out why he was here and why he was brandishing a weapon. The man said he was just there to help because he knew there had to have been a shooter in the house. The man introduced himself as Teddy Montoto, John's partner at the law firm. The officer said he didn't care who he was. He just wanted an explanation of how Teddy could possibly know there had been a shooter inside of the house, because the police had not made any announcements of any kind about what was going on at this property. Teddy looked at the SWAT officer and said he knew there was a shooter inside the house because he'd literally heard gunshots when he was on the phone with Susan Sutton. Later that night, detectives Larry Bellew and Art Nanny of the Miami-Dade County Police stood in the Sutton guest room, staring down at Susan's body. Both detectives were big guys with broad shoulders and barrel chests, and they both looked like they could handle themselves in a fight if they ever had to. Like the SWAT officers who had discovered Susan, it hit these detectives hard that Susan had desperately tried to save herself by hiding under the covers before she was killed. They couldn't imagine how scared she must have been in that final moment, and it made them both just so angry at whoever had done this. When the detectives had first arrived at the scene, they wondered if maybe John had murdered his wife and then failed to kill himself in an attempted murder-suicide. But the detectives had contacted paramedics and doctors at the hospital that John had been taken to, and medical personnel made it clear that John had multiple defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, so they were certain somebody else had shot him. Doctors also told detectives Bellew and Nanny that John had been placed in a medically induced coma because he had been shot in the head. A medically induced coma could help protect John from suffering brain damage if he even lived. So Bellew and Nanny knew that they could not talk to John to try to learn what had happened inside the house that night. Forensics officers and ballistics experts in the room told the two detectives that they had found enough evidence to determine that Susan had been killed by being shot at close range with a handgun. So as the forensics team continued to work, Bellew and Nanny thought they might already have their primary suspect, John's partner, Teddy, who had arrived out of nowhere waving a handgun around. So the detectives walked out to the street in front of the house where they had instructed Teddy to stay with several local police officers. Detective Bellew was all business when he approached Teddy. He'd already learned that Teddy was a very successful lawyer, so he was pretty sure Teddy would know how all of this worked. Bellew said they wanted to bring Teddy to the station for questioning, and they wanted to test his hands for gunpowder residue before they left. Teddy said he understood, and he told the detectives that they would most likely find gunpowder residue on his hands because he'd actually been at the shooting range earlier that day. Bellew and Nanny thought that it was possible that that could be true, but they also figured that being a successful attorney, Teddy would also know a trick or two to try to cover up his tracks. But the detectives believed that even the smartest criminals always miss something. So they were sure if Teddy really had killed Susan and then attempted to kill John, they would find out soon enough. In the early morning of August 23rd, a few hours after Susan's murder, her son Christopher was sitting outside the hospital room where his father was in a medically induced coma. And as Christopher sat there, he was listening to his little sister Melissa cry on the phone. Christopher and his fiancée had left the party at Susan and John's the night before and gone to a late movie. And when he got out of that movie, Christopher saw that he had a bunch of missed calls from Teddy, friends, and family. And not long after that, he had learned what happened to his parents. Christopher had at least been with his fiancée when he got the news about his parents, but he felt absolutely terrible that his younger sister was alone in her college dorm room in a place where she really still didn't know that many people. Christopher had always been very protective of Melissa when they were growing up, and even when he'd left the country to go to a boarding school overseas, he'd missed his sister more than anybody else. Outside the hospital room, Christopher listened to Melissa continue to cry on the phone, and as she did, he wished he could do more to comfort her. But Christopher told Melissa that he was still trying to figure out what had even happened and what was going on now, and he said he was really worried that whoever had killed their mom might actually show up at the hospital to try to finish the job on their dad. This sent Melissa into a complete panic, and she began saying she needed to come home right away, but she didn't have her car at school. Melissa said she knew Christopher needed to stay with their dad, so she would call Teddy, the man she referred to as her godfather, to come pick her up. Christopher thought this was a good idea, and he promised Melissa he would make sure nothing happened to their dad while he was there. They said they loved each other and then hung up. Then Christopher went back inside the hospital room to be by his father's side, while Melissa quietly packed a bag in her dorm room and tried to get a hold of Teddy. Melissa's initial calls to Teddy went unanswered because, at that time, he was sitting inside of an interrogation room across from Detectives Bellew and Nanny. The room they were in was barely bigger than a closet. It seemed designed to make people uncomfortable, but Teddy was actually unaffected by it. This was a guy who made a lot of money questioning and cross-examining people in court. He knew the law inside and out, and he almost always felt like he was 2 or 3 steps ahead of anybody he was talking to. But Teddy also respected law enforcement. He had relied on them throughout his legal career, so he did his best to be polite and attentive as the detectives questioned him. Bellew started by asking Teddy again why he had shown up at the Sutton house carrying a gun. Teddy said he had been talking to Susan on the phone about work when he heard, on her end of the phone, gunshots. He said Susan and John were like his family, so all he could think to do was just rush to help them if he could. The detectives nodded as Teddy talked, but they still were not sold on his version of events. They thought it was possible that Teddy could have attacked Susan and John and then rushed out of their house and then magically returned to the scene soon after trying to play the hero so police wouldn't suspect him. At some point, Bellew asked Teddy about his business relationship with John. He wanted to know if there were any financial issues between the two men. Also, Detective Bellew knew they were dealing with victims here who were multimillionaires, so a dispute about money had to at least be considered as a potential motive. But Teddy didn't miss a beat. He said he owed his entire career to John, and they both helped each other make a ton of money, so there were no financial issues at all between them. Detective Bellew just sat there and stared at Teddy. He had nothing against Teddy, and he wasn't ready to just declare Teddy guilty or anything, but it was clear that Teddy thought he was in total control of this interrogation, So Bellew wanted to take advantage of what seemed like Teddy's arrogance. Bellew asked Teddy if he would take a polygraph test, which would make it easier for police to cross him off their list, and Teddy agreed. So Bellew and Nanny stepped out of the room, and they began talking about how the interrogation was going as they went to go arrange for this polygraph test. Both detectives thought Teddy was the kind of guy who would believe he could beat a polygraph even if he was lying. But they were pretty sure if Teddy was lying, the test would catch him. Later that morning, Teddy would sit for his polygraph test. And afterwards, as detectives Bellew and Nanny went over the test results with the examiner, they were taken aback. It appeared that Teddy had told the truth on almost all of the questions he had been asked, but there were a series of questions that Teddy had almost definitely lied about when he had given his answer. And all of those questions had to do with Susan. Bellew didn't waste any time. He approached Teddy in the interrogation room. He leaned in close and said they knew Teddy had just lied on that polygraph test. And for the first time, Teddy's entire attitude changed. The confidence and bravado disappeared, and he slumped forward in his chair. Then he looked up at Bellew with a pained expression on his face. And in a quiet voice, he said he had betrayed his best friend. He said that he and Susan had actually recently begun sleeping together. Bellew immediately turned to Nanny. They didn't have to say anything to each other because they both knew a love triangle could be an even stronger motive for murder than money. There was a chance that Teddy, John, and Susan had gotten into a fight that got completely out of control, and that's how people got shot. Or maybe Teddy had flown into a jealous rage and just decided to kill both of them. At this point, Teddy knew the detectives were highly suspicious of him. And so he said point blank that he had nothing to do with the attack on Susan and John. He might have been a bad friend, but he loved them and their kids dearly. And later that day, police would release Teddy because they didn't have enough evidence to hold him at the time. However, they made it very clear to him that he should not leave town. Teddy said he understood, and he said despite what they think, he still wanted to help the investigation. Once Teddy was gone, Bellew and Nanny shifted their focus to the murder weapon. Susan had been killed with a handgun, and if it matched Teddy's gun, they would know they had their killer. They just had to find that gun. But over the next couple of days, as forensics officers updated the detectives, they discovered that Susan had been killed with a Glock 9mm pistol, and at that point, they could not connect that weapon to Teddy. Still, detectives Bellew and Nanny felt if they kept digging, there was a good chance they'd be able to place Teddy at the scene of the crime with that weapon in question. So they were still confident they had a strong suspect in the case. In early September of 2004, so a couple of weeks after the murder, John suddenly sat up in his hospital bed, trembling. He had recently come out of his medically induced coma, and doctors had told him that one of his eyes had been removed, and in his other eye, the optic nerve had been severed, which meant he was blind. Now, John had accepted that he would be blind for the rest of his life, and so he couldn't understand right now why he was seeing someone dressed in all black lurking in the corner of his hospital room. The person in black began to move forward, at which point John began to thrash around in his bed and he screamed as loud as he could, but the person in black was unaffected. They just kept moving closer and closer to John's bed. And then when they were right next to John, the person in black raised a gun and aimed it right at John. John screamed over and over again, and he tried to force himself out of his bed, but he just couldn't do it. And then John felt someone grab him, and he screamed and shook even more. But then John heard several people yelling his name and trying to get him to calm down, and he realized the person holding him was one of his nurses, and that she and several other members of the hospital staff were telling him that he was okay, and that nobody had been in the room with him. He was all alone. After several minutes, John did calm down, but he was convinced that Susan's killer had been in the room with him and that they had come back to finish the job and kill him. So John demanded to speak to the police. Later that day, detectives Bellew and Nanny headed to the hospital to meet with John. Neither of them believed the killer had actually been in John's room. They had spoken to John's doctors, so they knew the medically induced coma, the medication John was still on, and the recent loss of his sight could all lead to hallucinations. But the detectives also thought John might be starting to remember who had attacked him. So when they met with him in the hospital, they didn't write off what he was saying about the attacker coming into his room. Instead, they asked him questions about what this person in black looked like. Is there any sort of description you can give? Because they were thinking that maybe what he was really remembering was actually the real attacker. And the detectives were thinking the real attacker was very likely his law partner, Teddy. And so trying to get some sort of description from John that sounded like Teddy seemed like movement in the right direction for the investigation. However, John would say he really didn't have a good description of this person in black, and he just couldn't recall who the attacker was who killed his wife and tried to kill him. But John would say he knew it was not Teddy. Teddy was not their attacker. John would say, from what he could recall of the night of the attack, that Teddy just seemed shorter than the attacker, and also the attacker seemed to move a lot faster than Teddy could. After telling the detectives the little he thought he remembered about the person in black / the attacker, John demanded to be let out of the hospital. He said it was no longer safe for him to be there, that this attacker was going to come back and kill him. Doctors, nurses, and the detectives tried to reassure John that he was safe at the hospital and that he still needed more time in the hospital to recover. But John wouldn't hear it. And even his kids, Christopher and Melissa, who by this point had made it home, could not convince their father to stay in the hospital when they got there. So, against doctors' advice, John checked himself out of the hospital and went to stay with Christopher and his fiancée in their new townhouse. And almost immediately after moving in, John would tell his daughter, Melissa, to just go back to school, and John would begin to talk about how he needed to get back to work. John said his wife would not want the family to put their lives on hold just because she was gone. Leaving the hospital that day, Detectives Bellew and Nanny had been a little shocked by what they had seen. But after what John had experienced, they understood he would be in fear for his life until they found Susan's killer and put them away. And even though John said he was sure Teddy was not the person who had attacked him and his wife, the detectives still considered Teddy their main suspect. They just altered their theory about what could have happened a bit. They thought Teddy might have hired someone to do his dirty work for him, and that Teddy had been on the phone with Susan at the time of the murder just to make sure whoever he had hired had done their job. But even with the information on Teddy and Susan's affair, Teddy's failed polygraph test, and cell phone records that proved Teddy had been on the phone with Susan when she was killed, police still didn't have enough on Teddy for a murder case to hold up in court. So they spent the next several weeks looking for the Glock 9mm that had been used to murder Susan, and searching for this mysterious person in all black that John had claimed was in the hospital room with him. But Bellew and Nanny still knew there was a chance this person in black could have simply been a figment of John's imagination. But the search for this person and the search for the gun were very slow, and so as 2004 rolled into 2005, the detectives felt like they were running out of time, and that every day the killer walked free put John and his family in more danger. On March 16, 2005, almost 7 months after Susan's murder, Detectives Bellew and Nanny raced towards a small town less than an hour away from Coral Gables. They had gotten a call from local police who had just busted a petty drug dealer on a marijuana charge, and it turned out the dealer had a criminal record, including a recent charge for threatening 2 people with a Glock 9mm pistol. When Bellew and Nanny had gotten the call, they did a quick background check on the drug dealer, and they became convinced the drug dealer was connected to Susan's murder in some way. Bellew and Nanny arrived at the local police station, and an officer led them to a small interrogation room where this drug dealer was waiting for them. And after only a few minutes, and with almost no push from the cops, this drug dealer made it very clear to them who they thought killed Susan Sutton. Based on the meeting with that drug dealer, evidence found at the scene of the crime, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of how police believe someone murdered Susan Sutton on August 22, 2004. On that August day, at around 10 p.m., the killer walked through the shadows down the street towards Susan and John's house. They wore black jeans, a black long-sleeve shirt, black boots, and had a black knit mask pulled down over their face. They also had a Glock 9mm pistol clutched in their hand. The killer glanced at the large houses that line the street and imagined all of the stuff inside of them that must be worth stealing. But the killer had a mission to accomplish, so they turned their eyes back to Susan and John's house. A few minutes later, the killer crouched down as low as they could and ran to the side of Susan and John's house. There was a sliding glass door there that they knew did not lock properly. So they grabbed the door handle, leaned into the glass with their shoulder, which was all it took, and they slid the door open. The killer stepped into the dark home. They could hear a TV coming from the bedroom at the end of a long hallway. So they ran down the hall, passing another bedroom on the way. They got to the main bedroom at the end of the hall, and they threw open the door. And when they did, they saw John, who looked up from the bed with a look of sheer horror on his face. The killer took a few steps into the room, which was only lit by the flashing of the TV screen. The killer then raised their gun and fired. John screamed, tumbled from the bed, and fell to the floor. The killer immediately turned around and rushed out of the room and back down the hall. They came to the guest room, they threw that door open, and they saw Susan on the bed. Susan screamed and pulled the covers over her head, but the killer just walked towards her, raised their gun, and fired 6 shots directly into Susan. Bullets ripped through the comforter and sheets and struck Susan in the hands and also in her head, and she would die right there in her bed, her body slumped below the pile of covers on top of her. After that, the killer casually left the room and started walking back towards the sliding glass door that they'd used to enter the house. But when they got there, they heard a noise coming from the main bedroom. The killer immediately froze and then reflexively checked their gun to make sure they still had ammo. They'd lost count of how many times they'd fired their gun, but when they checked, they saw they were still all set. They had enough rounds. So the killer took a breath, they turned around, and marched right back down the hall. They walked back into the main bedroom, and they saw John trying to pull himself across the floor. The killer hesitated. The sight of John in agony somehow seemed far worse than a dead victim covered by bloody sheets. But the killer shook that off, and they raised their gun. John looked up, shouted something at the killer, and held his hands in front of his face to try to protect himself. The killer fired, and John immediately felt a bullet rip through the tip of one of his fingers and strike him in the face. Then another bullet tore through John's arm and struck him in the left temple. John collapsed on the floor in a pool of blood, and the killer assumed he was dead. The killer at this point rushed out of the bedroom, ran down the hall, and out the sliding glass door they had come in. The street was still quiet, but the killer was worried somebody might have heard the attack in the house. So they put their head down, started running, and weaved their way around the streetlights until they got to their car that was parked a few blocks away. The killer got into the car and drove off, and after they had gotten far enough away from John and Susan's neighborhood, they took off their mask and threw it onto the passenger seat. Then they grabbed their phone out of their pocket and made a quick phone call, but when it went to voicemail, the killer did not leave a message. They knew the person they were calling would call back as soon as the movie they were watching was over. Police had been right in their belief that the person who had killed Susan and tried to kill John had been hired to carry out the murder by someone else. But it was not Teddy, John's law firm partner who was having an affair with John's wife, Susan, who had hired the killer. It was Susan and John's adopted son, Christopher. It turned out that the boarding school Christopher had been sent to as a teenager wasn't some sort of upscale school for rich kids. It was a school located in Samoa that employed corporal punishment and hard labor to try to alter the behavior of children whose parents basically believed their kids needed some form of severe discipline. And when Christopher was a teenager, his parents, Susan and John, had started to believe that he was turning into this violent young man who they couldn't get under control. Christopher had physically threatened Susan and had even written down notes about how he could murder his parents to get their money. And so after local boarding schools had failed to change Christopher's behavior, Susan and John made a drastic decision. In the middle of the night, when Christopher was 16 years old, he had been taken from the home against his will, driven to the airport, and then shipped off to Samoa. And Christopher had never forgiven his parents for that. And so after Christopher had finally gotten out of that Samoa school and returned to Florida at the age of 19, he bided his time and started planning his parents' murder. Christopher had spent some time selling drugs right when he got back from Samoa, and not long before the murder, he had reconnected with a friend who had been a fellow dealer and who didn't have the same financial opportunities that Christopher had. Christopher knew that if his parents were dead, he and his sister would inherit millions of dollars, and so he promised this drug dealer friend that he would give him $100,000 if he carried out the murders. The drug dealer agreed to do it, and over time, Christopher helped him get a complete layout of Susan and John's home, including the sliding glass door that never locked the right way. Christopher also let the dealer know that his parents often slept in separate bedrooms. Then, when Christopher got word about the party to celebrate his mother's birthday and his father's successful legal case, he knew the time was right. Plenty of people would be at the house that night, so he thought that might mislead police into going down the wrong path. Then he would make sure he and his fiancée were seen at the party before they left and went to a late movie that would give Christopher an alibi for the time of the murders. But Detectives Bellew and Nanny had always thought that even the smartest criminals usually overlooked something, and they weren't sure if Christopher and his friend were all that smart. Because when Christopher's drug-dealing friend/hitman got busted on the drug charge, police discovered that he had called Christopher multiple times every day for months, starting just minutes after Susan's murder. And when they presented this call log evidence to the drug dealer, he quickly caved and confessed to the murder and immediately implicated Christopher as the guy who told him to do it. Then Christopher's fiancée admitted to police that Christopher had been talking to her about wanting to murder his parents since right after they met. She just never thought he would go through with it. And so police had more than enough evidence to arrest Christopher and bring the case to court. The drug dealer who actually pulled the trigger and literally killed Susan cut a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. As for Christopher, who actually was the mastermind behind all of this, he was convicted of murder and attempted murder and sentenced to 3 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2023, Christopher's father and would-be murder victim, John Sutton, continues to give money to experimental research programs that have the goal of giving people who have gone blind the chance to see again. On August 23, 2013, inside of a little home in a Russian suburb, 8-year-old Maria Chelyasheva was hard at work at her kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse. Maria's parents had recently brought her to a farm where she was able to do some pony riding, and ever since then, she had become obsessed with horses and ponies. And so as Maria was hard at work on her drawing, her father, 42-year-old Mikhail, was right nearby at the kitchen stove dicing up onions, and as he did, his eyes were kind of watering from cutting the onions, and so he was making a show of turning around and looking at his daughter, pretending to cry, and Maria thought it was very funny. And then at some point, as Mikhail was doing this, he realized he was missing a key ingredient for the dinner he was preparing. So he kind of threw up his hands in exasperation, and then he yelled out into the house to his wife, hey, do we have any potatoes? And from somewhere in the back of the house, Maria's mother called back, yes, we do, they're down in the cellar, but they're pretty old. And so Mikhail finished chopping his onions, he threw them into a hot pan, and then he walked out of the kitchen, poking Maria playfully as he walked by, and she kind of laughed at him. And then Maria watched as her father walked through the living room, past Maria's grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway, and that door led down into the cellar. And so Maria, she stopped for a moment and just watched as her dad opened the cellar door, began walking down the steps, and he shut the door behind him. And then Maria just went back to coloring in her horse. But after a few minutes, Maria started to smell something really bad, and she looked up, and she saw the onions that were on the burner were starting to burn, and smoke was going up into the ceiling, and then suddenly the smoke alarm went off, and as this commotion is happening, Maria's grandmother runs into the kitchen and begins fanning the smoke. She turns off the burner and moves the onions, and then Maria's mother comes running into the kitchen, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's looking around. She doesn't see her husband, and so very frustratedly, she yells out, "Mikhail, you burned the onions. Come in and deal with this." But Mikhail was not on the first floor. He was still down in the cellar. And so Maria's mother knew that, and she was kind of annoyed that he was taking so long down there. And so after muttering something under her breath, she stormed out of the kitchen, walked over to the cellar door, opened it up, went downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Maria's grandmother was now going through the burned onions, looking for any that were salvageable, and Maria had gone back to her horse drawing. But after about 5 minutes, it dawned on Maria that her parents had still not come out of the cellar yet, and it just felt like too much time had passed. They should be up by now. And so Maria stopped working on her picture and just stared down the hall at the cellar door. And at the same time, Maria's grandmother had stopped with the onions, and she too had come over and was watching from right next to Maria down the hall at the cellar door. Both of them just expecting the parents to emerge any second. But as the seconds ticked by, nobody emerged from the cellar, and so finally, Maria's grandmother said, "Okay, I'm gonna go see what's going on." And so Maria watched as her grandmother walked through the living room, past Maria's brother, who was playing a video game, and then Maria's grandmother, right in front of the closed cellar door, just yelled out, "Hey, are you guys okay down there?" But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this, Maria's grandmother turned around and told Maria's brother to turn off his video game because it was so noisy. Maybe they were calling from the cellar and they couldn't hear them. And so the brother, who was just totally frustrated by this whole situation, he paused his game. And then Maria's grandmother called out again, "Hey, are you guys okay down there?" And this time, when there was still silence, Maria's brother, he just stood up and said, "Okay, why don't we just go downstairs and make sure they're okay? Why aren't we doing that?" And so without waiting for a response from his grandmother, Maria's brother just walked right over to the cellar door. He opened it up and he looked down and he goes, "Look, they're right there." And then the brother began walking down the steps, yelling to his parents, "Hey, come on, when's dinner? What's going on?" And as he did, he shut the door behind him. And so after this, Maria's grandmother walked back into the kitchen and sat with Maria as the two of them stared at the cellar door, expecting their family to return any second now, but they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were really starting to panic. They could tell something was wrong. And so Maria's grandmother grabbed her phone and called a neighbor and just said, "Hey, can you come over? I think something's wrong. I don't know what it is." And then after Maria's grandmother hung up the phone, instead of waiting for the neighbor to come over, Maria's grandmother just got up and walked right over to the cellar door, then opened the door and began walking down the stairs. But this time, the grandmother left the door open. And so Maria was able to listen from her seat in the kitchen to the sound of her grandmother's footsteps making their way down the stairs. And then at some point, Maria heard what sounded like a distinct thud and then silence. Now, at this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else to do, she just got up and walked over to the open cellar door and just stared down into the darkness down below. She couldn't see anything, but she was too scared to even call out to her family. And then finally, she just began descending the stairs herself. 10 minutes later, the neighbor who Maria's grandmother had called finally arrived over at their house. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer, and so he tried the doorknob, found it unlocked, so he opened it up and he stepped inside. And right away, he looked around and it was totally quiet. There was nobody on the first floor of the house. But the neighbor immediately heard crying, and he walked around the first floor listening for where it was coming from, and he realized when he got to the top of the open door leading down into the cellar that the crying was coming from down there. And so without a thought, the neighbor just ran down the stairs, and he couldn't believe what he found. He found Maria, the 8-year-old, just crying on the ground, and all around her was her entire family just laying on the ground. Now, the neighbor had no idea what was going on, but sensing clearly there was some sort of emergency based on the call he got and what he was seeing now, he just scooped up Maria, ran upstairs, and ran out of the house and began screaming for help. When help arrived, they would search the house and make their way down into the cellar, and they would discover that Maria's entire family, her grandmother, her brother, her parents, they were all dead. and what had killed them were the very potatoes that Mikhail had gone down to get. It would turn out Maria's mother was right when she warned Mikhail that the potatoes they had downstairs were very old. In fact, they were so old, they had begun to rot, and as they rotted, they produced this toxic fume that did not ventilate out of the cellar. The cellar was totally enclosed, there was no windows, and the family had this habit of always shutting the door whenever they went down into the cellar. And so over time, this fume had totally filled the entire cellar, and one by one, as family members went down into the cellar, sealing the door behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was the only one who survived going down into the cellar because her grandmother, who had gone down right before her, had left the door open. And so by the time Maria had gone down, a lot of the toxic fumes had found their way up the stairs and escaped into the rest of the house. And so when Maria went down there, it was not nearly as toxic. Our next story is called Table for Two. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth, and on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor, we're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name, and Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around, and she was used to them spending lots of time together, and she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then, at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business, and so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house, and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard, and as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all, like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide. And the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so for a minute, investigators kind of scrambled because they're like, okay, if it wasn't poison in their food, what else could have killed these guys? There was nothing at the scene that would give away what could have killed them. And so they were just stumped. And so police were kind of confused for a minute. But then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth. And Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucien cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucien was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much, he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucien, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. The next and final story of today's episode is called Lucky Day. On an April morning in 1993, a surfer named John Doyle was sitting on a surfboard out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, just scanning the water waiting for a wave. John was totally alone out here. There were no other surfers, nothing, and the only sign of human civilization anywhere was John's Land Rover, which was parked up on the sand on the beach. John was an American. He was from Colorado, and so his experience had always been, lots of snow and mountains and trees because that's Colorado. But now here off the coast of Africa, it was like a totally different planet. And in fact, today, John was really feeling that because the sun was so hot that day. It was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and he could actually feel his back starting to burn as he sat there, waiting for the next wave. And so he told himself, actually, that he would just catch one more wave and then call it a day to avoid a sunburn. But as John continued to kind of scan out across the water waiting for this wave, he noticed about 20 meters away was a shark fin swimming in a circle, like stereotypical terrifying shark behavior. And so John is horrified and he wants to get out of the water immediately, but he's far enough away from shore that if he jumped into the water to swim to shore, he's going to be in the water with the shark thrashing around. He's just going to attract the shark over to him. And so John decides his only hope here to escape the shark is actually just to surf in. That way he'll stay out of the water. It's much faster. He'll get to shore. The shark can't follow him there. It'll be fine. And so, trying to stay calm, John continued to keep his eye on the shark that was still 20 meters away, and he also really looked closely for any swell coming towards him that might be big enough to allow him to surf to shore. And thankfully, after only a couple of minutes, John did see a swell coming towards him that seemed like it would be perfect for a final wave. And so at this point, John is facing out to sea, towards the swell, towards the shark that's still 20 meters away, and he turns himself around, so he's facing towards shore, and then he lays down on his stomach, and he begins to paddle towards shore. And as he's doing this, he's checking the swell to see when it's going to come up, when he can stand up, and eventually the swell is right underneath him, and as he's about to stand up on his board and actually surf into shore, he looks into the water that has not quite formed into a wave yet, and he sees the shark. It's literally underneath him. And so John has this sudden surge of adrenaline, and he just jumps up onto his board. He stands up, and for a second, he's stable. He's surfing, and he's riding this wave away from the shark. He's doing exactly what he hoped he could do. He can't believe it. And then, because he was panicked, because he was rushing, because it was a new board, who knows why, the nose of his board suddenly dipped just long enough to throw John off his board and into the water with the shark. And so immediately, as this wave is churning John over, he grabs onto his surfboard and just kind of holds on, and he's waiting for a moment when the wave stops so he can get out of the water, back on his board, and away from the shark. But before the wave even stopped tumbling him over, John suddenly felt the searing pain in his calf. And so John, who's underwater, still clutching his board, he opens his eyes underwater, then he looks down, and through the cloudy water, he can see very clearly it is the shark, and it's a great white shark that is latched on to his leg. And so now, in a total panic, John began punching the nose of the shark, and when he did, the shark actually recoiled and released his leg long enough that John could pull it out. He actually managed to get up onto his board again, and just a second later, almost out of instinct, he was back standing on his board, just surfing along with a leg that was now bleeding profusely into the water. And for a second, John was stable and appeared to be kind of moving towards shore again, but then the shark, it doubled around and swam at John from the side and literally smashed into him, knocking him off the board back into the water. But this time, John managed, when he fell this second time, to actually grab on to the board with both hands. So he has two hands on the board, he's getting tumbled in the water again, but he knows the shark is going to come for him. And so at the last second, he pulled the board close to his body and kind of turned himself like it was a shield. and the shark came flying towards him and bit him, but because he used that surfboard as a shield, the shark just bit the surfboard, ripped off half of it, and swam off with it and began mauling this half of the surfboard. And John, with the other half of the surfboard, he somehow managed to stand up on it. Again, his leg is bleeding everywhere, and he rode this damaged half surfboard into shore successfully away from the shark. And so when John pulled himself up onto the sand, out of the water, he looked back and he saw the shark swimming off. And even though he's in excruciating pain from this attack, he was so relieved. He couldn't believe he actually just survived that. But John did not have time to think about, what good fortune this was in a way, because he was an hour away from the nearest civilization. And between where he was now and that town, there was nothing. There weren't homes, there weren't buildings, there weren't offices, nothing. It was just totally wildlands until you got to that town. And so John knew he would need to get in his car and drive all the way to that town and then get the people of the town to go get medical help. So, he is hours away from getting the help he needs. And so he has no time to waste. And so he crawls through the sand. His leg is killing him, but he's just so focused on getting up to his Land Rover. And he manages to get to his car. He opens the door. He climbs in the driver's seat. And then as soon as he's in there, he shuts and locks the doors. And then he grabs a white t-shirt that he had on the passenger seat and he ripped it into strips. And he used those strips like tourniquets and he wrapped them around his leg, the leg that was bleeding from his calf. And he basically used this tourniquet to attempt to cut off blood flow to his entire right leg to stop the bleeding, to save his life. But the wound on his right leg was so bad and so deep that despite putting on multiple very tight tourniquets, it just wasn't doing very much. He was still losing blood at a pace that likely would kill him before he got to town. And so John was kind of like, well, nothing else I can do but attempt to go to town. So he fired up his car, he reversed off the beach, and began making his way towards town. As John sped along the road, he began to feel very lightheaded. Between the pain in his leg and the extreme heat outside, he just felt very dehydrated and weak. And so he thought to himself, if I can't get a sip of water soon, I'm going to pass out right now, and then I'm done for. And so as he's driving along, John began fumbling around his car, looking for any sort of liquid somewhere in the car. But ultimately, all he found was an empty water bottle. And all he saw in every direction was just this barren African savanna with no people and no water anywhere. And so John just kept on driving, hoping eventually he might find some water source. And luckily, after only a couple of minutes, when his eyelids were really starting to droop and he was having a hard time focusing, he noticed up ahead there was a copse of trees with a little creek that ran through it. And so immediately John pulled over and he got out and he hobbled his way over to the water. He laid down on his stomach so his face is basically right over the water. And then he just put his face in the water and began to drink. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to slow down. He felt himself relax a little bit. And he started to think to himself like, hey, I found water. I'm doing okay. Maybe I will survive this. But right as John was starting to feel optimistic, he felt a new shooting pain on his right side. And so with a little bit of strength he had, he managed to turn his head and looked to see what was going on. And staring back at him was a lion who had just bit his side and was now growling and staring at John and beginning to move its jaw left and right to really sink its teeth into John. Now, this is unbelievably painful for John, and he's already dealing with an unbelievable pain in his leg from the shark attack. And so John's experiencing pain that very few people ever get to experience. And it caused this unbelievable surge of adrenaline. One that you would likely get basically right before you die. That was the level of adrenaline he was getting. And with this adrenaline rush, he grabbed a stick and he began hitting this lion who's locked onto his ribs. And he managed to beat the lion off of him. And the lion, it only backed up maybe a few feet and it's still totally fixated on John and it's growling and edging towards him. But John, all he could do was just attempt to get to his Land Rover. And so as soon as the lion had let go of him, he just stood up and kind of pathetically began hobbling as fast as he could towards his Land Rover. And he literally just walked past this lion who's still growling at him, kind of trying to size him up. And he just kept on walking towards his car, and he was almost there when he noticed the sound of the lion growling behind him, which had been constant to this point, had suddenly intensified to the point where John couldn't even help himself. He had to turn around and see what was going on. And when he turned around, he saw now there was not just one lion, but an entire pride of lions. There was at least 4 lions that now had all formed a semicircle and were staring at John and moving towards him to eat him. But John really couldn't do anything about this. All he could do was just hopefully get to his Land Rover in time. And so John just turned back around so his back is to the pride of lions a few feet away from him, and he just continues hobbling towards his car. And as he walked, the lions began swiping at him and cutting his legs open and his arms open. I mean, they're like razor blades just being taken to the backside of him, but they didn't launch a full-bore attack on him. It was like they were just kind of testing him. And then right when the lions were basically about to actually pull John to the ground and eat him, was when John got to the door, opened it up, jumped inside, shut it, and locked it. However, when John went to grab his keys and start the car, he realized he didn't have the keys. And when he turned and looked outside, he saw the pride of lions and his car keys on the ground. He was doomed. He knew there was no way he could get those keys without getting killed in the process. And so John basically just resigned himself to die in his car right here. Like he knew, I'm going to die in the next few hours. There's nothing I can do. And so he just kind of sat there and waited. And 30 minutes later, John heard a very loud, almost explosion sound coming from somewhere outside of the vehicle. And then he heard it a few more times, and before long, the lions were so startled by it that they ran away. And then he hears what sounds like a series of shutter flashes, like camera flashes. And, he's looking around. He can't quite figure out what's even going on because, again, he has all these injuries. He's lost so much blood. And then eventually, John just kind of passes out, having no idea what had just happened. It would turn out there was actually a safari that was happening in the area where John was at the same time, and the safari guide, as they drove past this area, happened to spot John inside of his Land Rover surrounded by lions. And so as all the people in the tour began furiously taking photos of this crazy scene in front of them, the tour guide began firing his rifle into the sky to scare the lions off. And so those were the noises that John was hearing before he passed out. And then after he passed out, the tour guide and all the people on the tour pulled John out of his Land Rover, because now the lions are gone, and they would take him to a hospital where doctors and nurses would have to give him 250 stitches to stitch up all of his various shark and lion wounds. John would make a full recovery, and he would hang up on his wall in his office the broken half of that surfboard that he did successfully manage to ride in to escape the shark. He says the surfboard reminds him how lucky he was.
My screen glows brighter than the morning light. Another notification steals another night. Everybody's running, chasing something new. I stop for a second, asking what is true. A calendar packed from the start to the end. Always connected, but I miss my friends. 1,000 voices filling up the air. Still feels like silence everywhere. Just one moment. Put the world aside.
You walked in with that red dress sweat, like a match in the middle of May. My name fell slow from your tongue, and I forgot where I come from. Your heel taps like a warning sign. Your eyes say stay, your hips say mine. I try to act cool, play tough, but one look from you is enough. Oh, the room starts spinning when you lean that way. My heart keeps running, but my feet won't say. Cállate fuego, you set me on fire.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.